No desktop, no icons, just a blinking cursor on a 3.5-inch screen, a mechanical keyboard the size of your palm, and a pre-order price of $159.99. This is the SharkDeck, and it wants to convince you that the future of portable computing might be a terminal instead of a touchscreen. I have not held one. Almost nobody has. So this is not a review. It's a buyer's brief built entirely out of what the seller's own storefront says. And that storefront says more than they probably intended. Here's the frame for the next 9 minutes. A pre-order is a bet. You pay now for hardware that ships later, and the only evidence you get before you pay is the seller's own page. So I read that page the way I'd read any primary source, looking for the places where it argues with itself. I found 3. A promo panel that advertises hardware the spec sheet doesn't list, a 1-star review that isn't really about a broken device, and an AI ready badge that means something much narrower than it sounds. We'll get to all 3, but first, strip away the Cyberdeck aesthetic and ask what this thing actually is. Underneath the shell, the SharkDeck is a WalnutPi Zero 2W single-board computer running an Allwinner H618 chip, stuffed into a 3D printed retro case with a small mechanical keyboard bolted to the front. Now, that board name deliberately echoes the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W, and I want to be precise about this because it matters more than it looks. It is a completely different board family, with a different chip vendor and its own driver ecosystem. Same form factor, different world. And there is no desktop environment here. No file manager, no icons, no windows. Just Linux, stripped back to the terminal, which is either the entire appeal or an instant deal breaker depending on who you are. This is the spec table straight off the product page, and I'd pause here if you're considering one. 1 gigabyte of memory as standard, and unusually for this class of device, the board itself is swappable, so you can go to 2, 3, or 4 gigabytes later if and when a compatible board exists. 3.5-inch screen at 480 by 320. A real mechanical keyboard, not a rubber membrane. A UPS power board and a lithium battery so it genuinely runs untethered. And a GPIO header exposing 3.3 volts, 5 volts ground, the UART pins, and 8 general purpose pins. Every one of those numbers comes from the seller, which raises the obvious question. Compared to what? This is the seller's own comparison, and it's mostly fair. Against the PicoCalc Kit, which is really a microcontroller running basic style firmware on 264 kilobytes, the SharkDeck runs actual Linux. That's not a close call. They're different categories of machine. Against the CardputerZero, which caps out at 512 megabytes, the SharkDeck doubles the memory by default and lets you upgrade the board later. But look at the display row. Because they left their own loss in the table, the PicoCalc has a bigger, squarer 4-inch screen. The SharkDeck's honest win is memory and real Linux. It is not the screen, and I'd rather tell you that than let you find it out after the box arrives. Quick break. Everything I just checked. The CVE record, the vendor's own rating, the patch date, that is a phase 0 checklist. It is free at hiddenstatedrift.com/verify. If you want the version where we run it against your stack, that is the mastermind. Links below. So what is it for? The seller lists 5 things, and they're all plausible. Portable coding, SH into a server from wherever you are, write Python or Node, run Git, hardware prototyping, that GPIO header drives LEDs, sensors, buttons, relays, even small radio modules. System monitoring, the little screen doubles as a live dashboard for processor load, memory, temperature, and uptime. Retro computing, you can install an MS-DOS emulator and play DOS games on it, because of course you can. And the marketing bullets mentioned, but the spec table doesn't elaborate on voice input, fast speech to text, which brings us to the headline feature and the single most important asterisk in this entire video. The product page carries a badge that reads AI ready, Claude, Gemini, and OpenAI compatible. And I want to be careful because this is the one place where I'm going beyond what they actually wrote. They never say the word API. That's my inference. But it's the only inference that holds up, because with 1 gigabyte of memory, running a serious language model locally is simply not on the table. You'd be limited to very small quantized models doing very small things. So what AI ready almost certainly means is that the terminal can call somebody else's models over the network. That's genuinely useful. It is also completely dependent on having a connection and an API key. and it is not what most people hear when a device says AI. Here's the part that actually matters if you're trying to learn something rather than collect hardware. Because there's no desktop, you are forced into the command line for everything. Joining a Wi-Fi network, installing a package, generating SH keys, working through a Git branch. That's real friction, and real friction is how people actually learn Linux. You can't click past it. There's a counterweight I'd be doing you a disservice to skip. A Raspberry Pi has a decade of tutorials, forums, and driver support behind it. The WalnutPi and Allwinner ecosystem is younger and much thinner on documentation. You will be debugging more, and you'll find fewer answers waiting for you when you do. That's the trade. And speaking of things the documentation doesn't quite cover, scroll far enough down the product page and you hit a panel headed Multi-Protocol Power, which reads, One device, many tools, sub-gigahertz NFC, RFID, infrared, GPIO, USB-C, and microSD support. That is a striking list. It is also not supported anywhere else on the page. The technical specification table lists GPIO and UART and nothing else. The what's included list contains no radio of any kind. Now, I don't think this is deliberate deception, and here's why. M5 Shark's other products genuinely are radio and RFID tools. This reads like storefront-wide branding copy applied to a product that doesn't have that hardware. But if you're buying it expecting to sniff sub-gigahertz signals, read the spec table, not the panel. And then there's the reviews section, which currently reads 1.00 out of 5 based on one review. One buyer, verified, 11th of August. Their words, item malfunctioning, not booting up, would have to self-configure the OS or screen. Now read the seller's public reply because it's the most useful paragraph on the whole page. They explain that the SharkDeck operating system runs from the micro SD card, so the device will not boot without a properly prepared card, and if you bought the variant without one, you have to install that OS yourself first, which means the hardware probably worked perfectly. What failed was the expectation. Somebody paid $160, opened the box, and got a device that appeared dead. One review is thin evidence about build quality. It is excellent evidence about what happens when a required step isn't loud enough at checkout. So, 3 things before you put money down. 1. This is beta, and I'm not editorializing. Their own FAQ says, in writing, that they are actively improving the device, the software, the GPIO support, and the battery performance based on customer feedback. Translation, you are buying version 0.9, not version 1. 2. The microSD card is not an accessory, it is the computer. There are variants sold without one, and that's precisely how the 1-star review happened. Buy the 32GB version with the operating system pre-installed. The seller recommends it themselves on the same page. And 3. 1GB is fine for scripting, SH, and GPIO work. It is not an AI workstation, whatever the badge implies. Let me give M5 Shark some credit, because I've spent 9 minutes picking at their page. Plenty of companies ship version 0.9 and call it version 2. This one puts the word beta in the product title, admits in the FAQ that GPIO support and battery life are still being worked on, and answers its one bad review honestly and in public. That's more transparency than most hardware crowdfunds manage. The promo panel overreaches, and the SD card situation needs to be far louder at checkout. But nobody here is pretending this is a finished product. So here's where I land. The SharkDeck isn't trying to replace your laptop. It's a $160 bet that there's an audience who wants a pocket terminal, a GPIO breakout, and an AI API client in one object built by people who are openly still finishing it. That's a real product for a real person. It is just not a finished one, and the seller is the first to say so. The pre-order window closes August 31st. If beta hardware is your idea of a good weekend, this is a reasonable gamble at the price. If you need something that works the moment you open the box, wait for version 2. Either way, buy the variant with the SD card. Sources are in the description. All of it comes from the product page, so you can go check every number yourself.